Welcome to another Charles Cormier podcast. We have Aubrey the Gray with us today for round two. Aubrey's a legend in the longevity field. I interviewed him about 2 years ago or something like that. And there's been a lot of movement in this space. So glad to have him on today to talk about that. Quick intro about Aubrey right now in his roles. He's president and chief scientific officer at LEV Foundation. He's also co-founder of SENS still. SENS Research Foundation, and Viento. Right now, he gracefully accepted to connect. He's in a bar setting, which is quite unusual and epic. So, Aubrey, welcome to the pod again. Tell us a bit more about yourself and what you're up to.
Yeah, so thank you for having me back again. So as you say, my main role right now is I am leading LEV Foundation, which is a new organization. We created it about 2.5 years ago, and it really represents the next stage of the mission that I've been on, the journey that I've been on over the past 25 years since I came up with this extraordinarily counterintuitive realization that reversing aging is actually going to be easier than slowing aging down. Essentially because we can do reversing aging by damage repair, which is not something that we can do by manipulating our metabolism. So, to very, 40,000 foot level, explain the progression of that idea. What's basically happened is that starting back then, or not many years afterwards anyway, I began to work on the various components of the damage repair approach. Damage repair has components. It is inherently a divide and conquer approach. And some of those components are much easier to achieve than others. So, some of them were already being worked on by other people, but some of them were not, just because they were perceived to be too hard. So I positioned myself in a manner that I was able to work on those. And my first organization, the Methuselah Foundation, and also my second one, SENS Research Foundation, they were both focused on these particularly challenging areas of damage that the body does to itself throughout life, and that we need to repair one way or another in order to keep ourselves healthy as we get chronologically older. But at LEV Foundation, we are taking the opportunity to move to the next step. So, as I said, in my previous organizations, we were working on the most difficult of the components of the damage repair approach. But the easier components were already being worked on by other people. And a rapidly increasing number of those have yielded to the extent that in mice, we can now genuinely make them work to an extent that actually, we can extend mouse lifespan just by doing these things. So what is that last step? The last step is to combine them, to put them together in the same mice at the same time and get an additive effect, get more effect than we can get with any of them individually. If we can do that, then we're in a whole different world, because we're showing that actually, this divide and conquer approach is for real. And of course, it's only in mice, so there's a long way to go, but it's a hell of a lot better than if you haven't even done it in mice. So that's where we are focused at LEV Foundation. And about nearly 2.5 years ago, we began an experiment that was really big by the standards of this kind of work. We took 1,000 mice, divided them into 10 different treatment groups that got various subsets of a bunch of 4 very promising interventions in order to determine whether there was indeed this additivity, whether we could actually get more effect by combining these things. And, well, as with almost all experiments, the results were a little complicated. It wasn't completely 100% black and white, but it was close enough. I feel very happy to say that, yes, we demonstrated that we can get additivity here. So we are, of course, very eager to move on to do further experiments of this nature. The future experiments that we do are definitely going to include more than 4 interventions, probably 8 or more. And we already have plenty of them in mind. Even in the past 2 years since the first experiment that we began was started, there have been half a dozen reports from other groups showing life extension, starting with therapies that you don't even give the therapies until middle age. That's a really important feature here. That actually work, that actually give some significant extension of life. And of course, that means extension of healthy life, not just total life.
Love it. Last time you were on the podcast, you and I, we talked about AI. Sam Altman was on a podcast a couple of days ago, and he believes that super intelligence is going to reinvent a new type of science. If that super intelligence ever exists, would you actually leverage it to make new discoveries in your field?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I'm slightly pissed off that you didn't get me and Sam on the podcast at the same time, because I have a very...
I'll try harder.
Well, that's right. Because honestly, we have a lot to talk about. I've only met Sam a couple of times. He visited my lab a couple of times because his company, Y Combinator, was literally 200 yards away from mine for a while. But fact is, Sam has done a huge thing in the longevity space. Forget about AI for the moment. Sam dropped $180 million on a very talented guy named Joe Betts-Lacroix, good friend of mine, to start a company called Retro Biosciences, which was designed to, well, as the name implies, to turn aging into reverse, retro, right? And Retro are doing very good things. Honestly, the only thing that Sam could have done better would have been to hire me and Joe at the same time, because Joe and I are very aligned. And, I probably know more about the science of rejuvenation, but Joe certainly knows more about how to run a company. So, that would have been a match made in heaven, and I think Sam missed a trick there. But fact is, Retro are doing far better, far more per dollar than the other companies that other wealthy people have funded. Like, for example, Altos is not doing too badly, at least not yet. Jeff Bezos obviously dropped $3 billion on Altos. Calico is an indescribable catastrophe, a complete waste of billions of dollars. And, there are other examples. But yeah, Retro is really doing good stuff. So hats off to Sam Altman. Now, coming back to your question, though, is AI going to play a role? Oh, for sure. It's already playing an astronomical role. The work that OpenAI, that Sam's company has done, I would not put it at the top of the list as of today, because, that's a very high bar, because DeepMind obviously produced AlphaFold, which is like completely game-changing. And for that matter, other companies in this space that are dedicated to aging, such as in silico medicine or BioAge, have also done extremely important stuff using state-of-the-art machine learning. But there's definitely more to come. We already know, as I've just said, that Sam is very interested in this space. It looked for a short while, I'm going to say, maybe a year ago, as though Sam had decided that, wet, lab work with pipettes and cells and stuff was not really the way to go, and we should just try to solve aging completely in silico. But my latest information is that he's kind of, realized that that's a little bit stupid, to be honest, and he's come back to realizing that we actually need proper physical data to give the AI to, so it's a bootstrapping thing between the two, which is definitely the right way to think about it. A large part of the reason why I was scared about that a year ago was because there are other people who've thrown respectable amounts of money into the field, and who have also gone that very much that direction. It's a tragedy, because it's very misguided. So I'm very pleased that Sam is coming back to sanity in that regard.
Right. And how are you leveraging AI right now in your lab to
So,
accelerate discoveries?
great. So we are actually not. I mean, you can't do everything, right? And so we're playing to our own strengths. We know how to keep mice happy and alive for a lifelong time, and we are working to get them alive for a longer time. So, we are working very closely with all of these other people. Every single person that I've mentioned, Kristen Fortney, Alex Voronkov, whatever, these are great friends of mine. These are people that I've been collaborating with for a very long time. But they are following, that they're playing to their strengths and we are playing to ours.
Right. You mentioned that, yeah, in silico would possibly be stupid, but what if we could reproduce a mice in silico fully? That seems like a gigantic task for sure, but that would also accelerate the full process. Why do you think it would be stupid to fully crack it in silico?
Okay. So first of all, let us be very clear for the audience that when I talk about in silico, I am not talking about in silico medicine, the company. The company in silico medicine is a fantastic company. They're doing wonderful work. They're led by an amazing guy, Alex Voronkov. So what you just said was not about that company. It was about doing stuff in silico, right? Now, I don't say it's stupid. What I say is it's stupid to focus on it to the exclusion of other work, of work in the laboratory. Because at the end of the day, AI does not generate wisdom out of thin air. It generates wisdom out of data. It needs data to start from. And we see this even in really simple systems like board games. So you probably remember that the way in which DeepMind became really famous was through solving, essentially, being far better than any human at the game of Go. And it's important to look closely at what they actually did there. There was a version of AlphaGo, the first version, that got to the point of, beating the world's best people. Fine. And that version began by being taught by a training set of games between human experts, a big database of those, right? Now then, after that, they produced this thing called AlphaGo Zero, which did not start from anything except the rules of the game. So, of course, it took quite a long time to get better than a 5-year-old at playing Go, because it didn't have any hints to start from. But once it did figure out something about how to play Go, it accelerated, and eventually it wiped the floor with the version that did start with the expert games. So what do we learn from this? Well, one thing we learn is that the expert games were somehow biasing and contaminating the open-mindedness, if you like, of the machine learning. Fine, but David Silver, the 6-Dan Go player who led the AlphaGo project, was very, very clear in public, saying they could never have done AlphaGo Zero without first doing AlphaGo. In other words, the code, the actual structure of the machine learning algorithm was informed by the training set, by the expert games, even if the actual execution of that program was not. And that's going to be exactly the same when it comes to anything in any other realm, including protein folding like AlphaFold and including aging.
Got it. And in your opinion, what would that super intelligent assistant look like in the future? If it would help you develop what you're doing right now, what would it look like? Would it just be an assistant that would run experiments in the lab? Would it have a robotics component? What would be that super intelligent assistant that would help you 1000x accelerate your research?
So there's no one answer to that question. Improved robotics is really important in biomedical research in general, in biology research, in fact, in science research. And we're seeing steps towards that all the time. One company that we're working very closely with, which I'd like to give a shout out to, is Olden Labs, OLDEN. They are led by a fantastic guy who's a huge fan of our work called Michael Florea. And they are creating what are called smart cages. So mouse cages with lids that have a lot of equipment like to do like constant videoing, like CCTV, and also a whole bunch of other things like that. So what we get from all this is a huge amount of automation of the process of doing these experiments on mice that reduces manpower, reduces costs. And we love that. And so do a lot of our funders. So that's all wonderful. But that's not what you would call AI. That's just kind of robotics, really. And well, it's not even robotics. It's just like using computers smartly. But absolutely, there's plenty of ways in which robotics can be used to speed up and lower the cost of biomedical research. If we move as far as looking at what artificial intelligence could do, and especially what artificial superintelligence could do, what we think is coming fairly soon, then honestly, it's unwise to speculate too specifically. We just don't really know. One thing that Sam Altman said, coming back to Sam, when he was in his phase of kind of, seeming to have moved away from the relevance of wet work, well, he said, yeah, wet work matters, but we'll wait until the AI tells us what experiments to do, which is like, as such, kind of no. It's a bootstrapping thing. You've got to give the AI the information from wet work in order to let it figure out what next experiments to do. So it's a feedback loop. And my sense is that Sam has got that message now.
But didn't AI figure out reasoning by itself? Sort of like they didn't really teach it reasoning. It just came about sort of magically. We cannot explain it still.
Kind of. So, as I guess most people know, I was not always a biologist. I was originally an artificial intelligence researcher. But that was in the 1980s, when nothing that we look at today and we think of as AI remotely existed. Back then, the whole idea of using something that was vaguely modeled on the structure of the brain, in other words, what's called a neural network, was completely out of fashion. I mean, so out of fashion that it was just looked down upon. There were like literally 3 labs in the world that were persisting on working in this area. And it was one of those labs, the lab of Jeffrey Hinton, that made the key breakthrough that showed that actually, this pessimism, this skepticism about that approach was mistaken. Back then, I was working on what you just said, reasoning. I was developing, programs that would find mistakes in other programs. I was developing programs that would prove mathematical theorems automatically. And, that's I was working on it because that's what I'm good at. But the fact is, it's nothing to do with AI today. So today, we'd like AI to do reasoning, but really only for the purpose of explaining to us why it is making the decision it is making, which is not the same as using reasoning to make those decisions in the first place.
Right. If we're going to crack superintelligence in the next 2 years, well, first, do you agree with that assumption? Because it seems that most top CEOs from Anthropic, Sam Altman, are agreeing with that timeline. Shouldn't we just stop everything we're doing and focus on cracking superintelligence, or at least being part of that race?
So, if it were the same people and the same expertise and the same resources working on the two things, then there might be a case for what you just said. But the fact is, that's not the case. At the moment, we've got a bunch of money being thrown at improving AI, and we've got a bunch of money being thrown at the wet work to improve our knowledge of how aging works and how we might fix it. That second pot of money is ridiculously small, far too small. Something's got to, so the net effect is less than it could be if there were better balance between the two things.
Question for you. Like we talked about your optimism towards cracking longevity. I believe back then it was in the next 10 years. Are you even more optimistic about that prediction right now? Has it changed since the last 2 years we spoke?
So for the past few years, what I have been saying is that I think that we have a 50-50 chance of reaching longevity escape velocity within about 12 to 15 years. I have to, with a very heavy heart, tell you that at the moment, over the past couple of years, that timeline has been slipping. And the reason it's been slipping, the number one reason that my estimate has been slipping, is because we don't have the money to do our next big lifespan experiment. There has never been a time in my entire 25 years in this field when I have felt that the work that I myself am doing with my organization is as critical path as it is now. And at the moment, it's being slowed down by lack of funds. So it is critical path.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, of course, there's a whole bunch of things that fold into it. One thing is, charitable giving to research is lower than it used to be generally. There's always, our work has always been mostly funded by a very small number of people who write large checks. Of course, we have a large number of people who write small checks, and we're extraordinarily grateful to those people, but they have never, in aggregate, constituted more than 10 or 20% of the total amount that my organizations have spent. And that remains true today. So at the end of the day, it's stochastic. There are people who, every single wealthy individual is different. They make their own decisions in their own ways. That's all I can really say.
And tell me about the foundation model. Don't you think should turn it to a capitalistic model and have products out there, which is a difficult thing, but would instantly bring potentially more funds?
Oh, sure. So, let me be very clear. I am totally fine with capitalism. And in my previous organization, SENS Research Foundation, this was very clear. Our business model for most of that foundation's existence was to take projects as far along as necessary in the non-profit context so that they had, proof of concept, such that some of the more courageous early stage seed investors would be willing to they didn't want to donate, or maybe they weren't donating very much, but they were willing to invest. And at that point, we would spin the project out as a startup company, and the investment would happen. And of course, investors tend to write bigger checks than donors do. So the result was, of course, the work started to go faster. So we did that half a dozen times, and a few of those companies have done very well. So fantastic. But the point is that it only works for some of the things that we need to do. First of all, any individual project has to get far enough along to become investable, even in the eyes of these more courageous early stage investors. But second of all, the stuff that just isn't investable, and what we're doing at LEV Foundation is like that. What we're doing is combining things that already work individually a little bit and, seeing whether they work more. And as and when they do work more, we're very happy, but where's the intellectual property? There's basically none, right? Because the individual things that we're putting together, either they're owned by other people, or they're not owned by anybody, like they're off patent or they're unpatentable in one way or another. So the work we're doing at LEV Foundation is really very hard to monetize in a, shall we call it, a capitalist way. And, you know, this is a simple argument that the high net worth people I talk to do understand. So, you know, it's just a matter of persuading them that, yes, it's worth putting money in anyway. Now, there's a slight wrinkle here, which is quite important to emphasize. Supposing you're a wealthy investor and you really don't like giving money away, but you have invested in longevity companies, right, already, then what do you want? You want return on that investment. You want that return to be as big as possible, as soon as possible. How does that happen? Well, a key part of this is that a rising tide floats all boats. If the work that we're doing at LEV Foundation succeeds well, then it makes the entire field grow faster, because the entire field will be given more credibility by virtue of the fact that people in general see that longevity really is malleable, not just in like nematode worms, but in like species that have, you know, legs and fur and stuff, right? So that happens, everyone wins, and in particular, the companies that this hypothetical person I'm talking about has invested in will also do better. So it's an indirect means to an end to donate to us, even if you don't like giving money away.
Right. I think they'd like to have access to a product that could ultimately make them live longer, right? That would be the greatest ROI ever.
Right. Yeah. And this is why we work in mice. I mean, a huge amount of the rhetoric that my colleagues spend time emphasizing revolves around this word health span. We want to keep people healthy longer. We don't care about making people live longer. And of course, it's true that we do not care about living longer in a poor state of health. But it's also irrelevant because nobody has any even idea of a way to make people live longer in a poor state of health. The only way we're going to make people live significantly longer is by making them live healthy longer. Living totally longer is a side effect of that, right? So I feel there's too much emphasis on that. But worse than that, this health span thing kind of distracts people from the real goal here. So, you know, if you actually were to take mice, for example, and you make them healthy for longer, but then they all keel over on the same day, so, you know, they basically don't live longer, then people will say, you haven't really affected aging then, have you? You've affected, you know, some diseases of aging or whatever. And so the prejudice, the dogma that aging is somehow off limits to medicine is reinforced. It persists. So we have to show actual lifespan extension. It's the only acid test. It's the only thing that will persuade the world that we really are doing something about aging.
Right. And last time we talked about Brian Johnson, right? His personal approach and very much biohacker approach to things. And I think he's been quite successful at unaging. Have you had any new thoughts towards what Brian is doing? Obviously, it's not that scalable in others, but it is causing people to give more attention to longevity, isn't it?
So Brian has become progressively more of a polarizing figure in the field as time has gone on. A lot of people feel, to be perfectly honest, that he is a net negative to the field, that he has kind of trivialized the field in ways that they wish would not have happened. I am not in that camp. I believe that, yes, there are things that I wish he wouldn't say, but the fact is, he's a net positive. The main reason why he's a net positive is because he is a force unto himself. He does what he wants to do regardless of who ridicules him. And if there's anything that comes at the top of the list of things that hold people back from getting properly involved in the longevity crusade, it is herd mentality. It is failure to do what Brian does, and of course what I do. going out and saying what the hell I think, however many people think I'm crazy, right? And just like me, Brian has evidentiary basis for what he thinks. Now, I think most of the reason why I would say he's probably not doing himself favors all the time is that sometimes he describes his experience and his choices in a manner that sounds like he's recommending that everybody should do what he does, which he isn't really doing. What he's really doing is saying everybody should pay attention to their own body. Yes, everybody should try to not die, but different people have different ways of not dying, and he kind of, de-emphasizes that a bit too much sometimes, I feel.
Because I think us biohackers and people that care about longevity, it sort of starts with ego and megalomania or God complex, but then it morphs into I just love life and I want to keep living, right? Is that still the main underlying philosophy?
I think it is for Brian. For me, it's never been like that. I've always looked at this from a purely arithmetic point of view. I've said to myself, well, okay, look, I could dedicate my life to the defeat of aging. What would this achieve? It might hasten the defeat of aging. I know it's possible, therefore I know it's going to happen anyway, even if I do something else with my life. However, if I dedicate myself, maybe I could do something. And as time went on, I made contributions, and I felt, there's a chance that I might make as much as 5 years, outside stretch goal 10 years, hastening of the defeat of aging. But if I look at what that means for me, myself, in terms of my chances of, making the cut, making it to longevity escape velocity, it's 5 or 10% maybe, at best, which is a little underwhelming, honestly. And so I've never looked at that as the main thing that gets me out of bed. For me, it's all about humanity. I am doing this because I'm a humanitarian first and foremost. I'm doing this because every single day that I bring forward the defeat of aging, which I think I probably do every month, I'm saving 110,000 lives. That's more than 30 World Trade Centers. That's quite easy to get out of bed for. And I've always thought this way. I do not think about it in terms of myself or even my loved ones. I think about it in terms of humanity.
Of that. Yeah, that's a very utilitarian way of viewing things. Obviously, there's been people that have been sort of blurring that utilitarian movement, not to name Sam Beckman as of late, but yeah, it's a complex formula, isn't it? How has that formula of yours to achieve that goal of saving 110K lives per day, how has that changed over the last 40 decades of your life?
It really hasn't changed at all. But actually, let me pick up on something you said in the middle of your question. You mentioned Sam Bankman-Fried, and I think you mentioned him because of his rather high-profile association with the effective altruism movement.
Yeah,
so
correct.
Effective altruism is, of course, a very high-profile and valuable movement focused on essentially humanitarian goals, just as I just said, and I'm sure that's why you mentioned it. But here's the thing. Effective altruism is all about quantifying the impact of every dollar one donates to, or every dollar or every hour, depending on what you're donating, right? And there is a huge divide in the effective altruism movement with regard to the longevity crusade. This is something that a lot of people don't know, but it's very important, and it's existed for a long time. That some people will say, well, extending healthy life and total life, if we can do it, just like astronomically outweighs absolutely anything else we could possibly do. The bang for the buck is way ahead of anything else. And therefore we should throw money at it. And the other camp says, well, yes, that is true, but it's reliant on a good assessment of the probability that X amount of dollars spent now would actually make a difference to the likelihood of success or the date, how soon success is achieved. And this faction within effective altruism, they say, listen, we just can't quantify that. We can't come up with an actual number that we can believe. The reason we can't is because the only people who actually know enough about this field are the experts who are biased. They will give inherently over-optimistic things because that's what they always do to get money from the government or whatever. And of course, there's a certain amount of validity to that. But the reason why it's not completely valid is because we might just be right. We might just be right. And so, it's a real stalemate within the effective altruism community. But I have to say, very sadly, that the faction that says, well, we can't quantify it, so let's give our money to mosquito nets in Africa instead, has dominated, at least over the past decade or so.
Right. And what if their side of the argument would be that, rich, terrible, evil people would use that to just live forever and subdue other population. There's also been the overpopulation argument, and the population levels are falling with time, which should probably help or solve climate change and so forth. What would you say to that side of the argument?
Well, of course, I've answered all of these questions literally more than 1,000 times over the past 20 years in about 1,000 interviews and talks. So, I won't bore your audience by just regurgitating everything I've said before. But the fact is, nobody who puts any kind of effort into this field really believes any of those arguments. They know perfectly well that the amount of suffering caused by aging is so astronomical that even if these supposed issues these problems that might be created by the elimination of aging actually came to pass, it would still be complete rounding error compared to the amount of suffering that we're saving. Quite apart from the fact that there are absolutely clear reasons why none of these things actually would come to pass, which obviously goes down to the specifics. Like, you just mentioned like evil people. Like, my standard answer to this is a little bit frivolous. I say, last I checked, dictator was fairly high on the league table of risky jobs. Not a lot of dictators die of aging in the first place. And the ones that do have tended to organize their succession beforehand, so they're effectively immortal anyway. So again, complete nonsense. And right. It's not hard to give these arguments. It is a little boring to me that I have to carry on giving them over and over again. Literally, I must have done it more than 1,000 times. But this is the nature of the pro-aging trance. People just do not want to believe that aging is a bad thing. They want to believe that aging is a blessing in disguise.
Right. Well, it's human nature, right? Like to be quite emotional and not look at the stats and the facts. But I think that it could create a pretty strong divide, not longevity in itself, but AI in itself, and super intelligence would be accessed by very powerful people. And you could very much see a world in which 80% of the population would be on UBI eventually and just jerking off their full day, and like very rich people on another planet, and that divide continuing. I don't think that would necessarily be a bad thing, right? Like I think both would be happy, but
so let's
it could
talk about
lead to tricky stuff.
So let's talk about that for a moment. So one of the things that people say about the idea of living a lot longer is, oh dear, how will we pay the pensions? We'd have to get people to work a lot longer. And of course, the thing that this totally ignores, but that everybody actually knows when they remind themselves, is that automation is coming, and that we're going to have a lot fewer. Even really conservative organizations like the United Nations are perfectly happy to say that literally more than half the jobs that exist today will not exist in 2050. That's definitely overly conservative, but it's fine, right? So it's perfectly clear that we are going to develop a means of distributing wealth that does not rely on the concept of essentially full employment. It will not be like what happened in the Industrial Revolution when, huge swathes of jobs disappeared, but they were replaced by this thing called the service industry that we didn't have enough people for before that. right? That will, I mean, how many people do you need in the entertainment industry? Not a lot, right? So, so there will be UBI, or, well, let's be clear, UBI, Universal Basic Income, is a very blunt instrument. It's the first idea, it's the best idea, but it's going to undergo a whole bunch of refinement in practice. But it's going to happen one way or another. So people say, oh dear, we're going to have to increase the retirement age and increase it. Actually, what's going to happen is the retirement age is going to go down. Work is going to become like what in the UK used to be called national service, conscription, right? Where, when you're a young adult, you might do a couple of years of work because we need a few people to, to tell the machines what to do or whatever. But then after that, you don't. You do what you like. That does leave a really important question, which is self-esteem. How do people obtain their, high opinion of themselves without being given an external source in terms of a paycheck? And work remains to be done on that. But of course, my answer is more social interaction. At the end of the day, what we really get our self-esteem from is each other. And getting it through a paycheck means getting it through each other without even meeting the other, which is a bit mediocre in the first place. So having a greater amount of social interaction will, that doesn't involve social media, preferably, will be a big step forward.
Right. Yeah, I think we're going to have a score as well of how useful we are to society, right? Or social we are. And we're going to play like.
It's going to happen, no. Because the point is, you only need that if you're trying to allocate who gets more resources and who gets fewer resources. And if basically everything's going to be free, then that doesn't matter. I mean, there are some.
It's a gamification, right? Like it's not an economical thing. It's just like I'm playing this game to be a better human being, to be more valuable. And I think evolution is like deep ingrained into us and want to compete on one thing.
We shall see. I mean, first of all, we have to be very careful about the idea that anything is deeply ingrained in us by evolution. Look at reproduction. Having as many kids as you possibly can seemed a couple of hundred years ago as though it was deeply ingrained in us by evolution. And look what the hell we're doing now. Whenever any country, with the sole exception of Israel, gets to a certain level of female emancipation and education and prosperity, fertility rate goes through the floor, right? So, do not believe in what you think. Evolution has ingrained it in us.
Right. I just think, it's that notion of having enough cash to pay for all of these children's, right? So there's the capitalistic system, and then there's like the marriage concept, right? Which may change with AI companions and all of that we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, just no. I mean, first of all, never try to second guess how the world is going to be even 30 years from now, let alone 130. Right? Because there are just so many unknown unknowns, so many things that we can't even imagine now that are likely to happen. Right? Like the internet. I remember the pre-internet world, right?
Yeah, it was crazy. Like AI is like magic. Never in 1,000 years, most of us would have think you would have like this genie in a bottle. It's quite hard to predict. As a scientist, what is your thinking on quantum and luck? Like do you factor that in? Do you think that's why it's so complex to predict the future?
No.
No, so purely deterministic.
I don't think that it matters whether it's deterministic or not, is what I'm saying.
Okay. The recent development in cancer that we're seeing, like I've had a lot of cancer biotech CEOs and founders on this podcast, and they're quite bullish about solving cancers in the next 10 years. How does that impact you in the longevity field?
So, of course, almost all cancers are age-related. They affect elderly people more than young people. So it's very much part of what I work on. We have had a lot of over-optimism over the past half century with regard to how close we are to bringing cancer under proper medical control. I have looked at that unedifying history and have been appalled, to be honest. I find it very difficult to believe that the experts who said the things they said over these years really believed what they were saying. Because throughout that entire half century, we have known perfectly well that cancer is unique among age-related problems in the sense that it benefits from natural selection, genomic instability. So the idea that one could turn it into a chronic disease like Alzheimer's or like, atherosclerosis is just such elementary nonsense that, I cannot believe that anyone really ever believed that. But they said it. Now, however, we are in a different world. First of all, we have much better tools for fighting fire with fire, specifically fighting the natural selection within a cancer with the natural selection that goes on in the immune system. And so the huge breakthroughs that were made 10, 15 years ago in cancer immunotherapy, specifically the concept of CAR T cells and also the concept of checkpoint inhibitors, this came from that. Very, very important. The single thing that I'm most excited about right now with regard to truly universal or close to universal cancer therapy is a single drug, an extraordinary discovery, a single drug that kills off cancer cells just because they are expressing at high levels this enzyme called telomerase that allows them to keep going and not senesce. It's the most extraordinary discovery made maybe 10 or 15 years ago by a friend of mine in Texas. It was licensed to a company up in Chicago, and that company has taken it forward through. It's now in phase 2 clinical trials in Australia. Everything's going very well. I've done my small amount to help in terms of promoting this work, having the CEO at my conferences, things like that. But I really believe that it's going to be the single biggest thing for cancer ever.
You have various friends like that made groundbreaking discoveries. What are the patterns shared amongst great researchers like that?
The reason I'm hesitating to answer is because, honestly, maybe there are some patterns, maybe there are not. The big reason why there is a pattern is that they are willing to step outside of the box and think outside of the fashionable paradigms. But the reason there's not a pattern is because very often this happens as a kind of afterthought, a kind of side effect of the work that they're mainly doing and mainly known for. Because, you see, nearly everybody works within the system, the academic system and so on. And as such, they are required to pretend to be harmless, to pretend to be doing things that everyone already agrees are valuable. And that's almost the opposite of what science should be doing. Science is supposed to be people doing things that everybody else thinks is crazy. Because if you're not in a minority of one, you're probably not going to discover much, right? So, I've written about this in the past. I feel very strongly that the concept of peer review, of only getting money to do something if you can convince other people in advance that it's a good idea, is, by far the biggest catastrophe that has happened to science in the past century.
Right. And if we take this from another way, what makes an Aubrey an Aubrey? What makes a researcher the best of class? What are super skills that they nurture that AI couldn't replace?
Honestly, at this point, I would not identify any particular thing that AI could not replace. There are certainly things that AI cannot currently replace, but AI is improving so rapidly, that I would not want to. I would not feel confident saying that anything that I do, for example, that a machine would not be able to do 10 years from now.
Because it's pattern recognition, I guess, in the end, and intuition, but that's also replaceable, right?
Precisely, precisely. I mean, intuition really is pattern recognition. It's like understanding how to do pattern recognition well. You know, the difference between a good scientist and a great scientist is probably that. It's probably that the good scientist recognizes certain types of patterns, the ones they've been taught to recognize, basically, and the great scientist has a deeper understanding of what pattern recognition really is.
And
But
we're almost
AI
hitting,
will be better than us at that, than any of
yeah,
us.
I agree with you. We're almost hitting up on time here. Various times you mentioned funding, right? You also mentioned that some researchers do a bit too much marketing to get that funding, sort of stealing it away from your lab, for example. How much are you focused on being truthful vs like marketing your fund? Do you have like a percentage on that?
Um, well, first of all, I don't want to be quite so uncharitable as what you just said. I think that if one is working in the private sector, especially, then, you know, one's got to fight fire with fire. Everyone's somewhat hyping their technology. You know, it's just, it goes with the territory. If we compare and contrast the for-profit world with the non-profit world, however, then I think we can say that people in my position, you know, I'm very much on the non-profit side, have a greater responsibility and also a greater incentive to not exaggerate, to not hype anything. Um, and, you know, it's an interesting question because when I started out talking about longevity escape velocity and the idea that, you know, people were quite likely to live to 1,000, um, the first reaction of a lot of my colleagues was that I was doing hype to the max, right? That I was just sensationalizing. And of course, the reason they thought that was because they were terribly petrified of the idea that I would bring the field into disrepute by saying these terrible things. Um, and they didn't look at the reasoning that got me there. But of course, that reasoning has gradually, you know, become understood, and it's understood that I wasn't hyping anything whatsoever. So yeah, hype is a complex concept.
What questions are you asking yourself regarding longevity or life or anything, matter of fact, nowadays?
I'm too busy to ask myself questions. I just get on with the job.
Do you use like AIs to interact and spare brain with these AIs nowadays if you're not around students?
No. And anyway, I am around students all the time. I mean, not students in the sense of me being a professor, but I'm around people who are learning from me all the time.
Got it. What's next for you? What are your top priorities this year?
Get the next $1 million in the bank. You know, I mean, it's mostly that. I wish it were not. You know, it's extremely painful having to spend so much of my time trying to raise funds. But of course, I have that in common with basically every scientist in the world. So I'm not exactly complaining. I'm just like hoping.
And would that be doable via crowdfunding, for example,
Oh, sure.
biohacking longevity community?
Oh, sure. We are definitely working in that to do that. You know, it remains to be seen. I would be overjoyed if we were able to get proper money through crowdfunding. So far, the overwhelming majority of the money, as I mentioned earlier, has come from a small number of large donations rather than a large number of small donations. But if that were to change, that would be overjoyed.
Let's talk after this podcast because, yeah, not sure if you read some of that yesterday, but some AI researchers are being paid $100 million in bonus just to go from OpenAI to Meta nowadays. And
Yeah.
if these folks invest 1% in you, their yearly annual salary, that would be it. You know, that would be checked. Uh,
You don't say.
yeah, and I can outreach to these people via email just to let them know. So, Aubrey, thank you for coming on. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, of course, LEV Foundation. You know, levf.org. You can put it in the show notes, I'm sure. And There's plenty of information there. You can email me at aubrey@levf.org. So yes, I am very easy to find online.
So that was Aubrey, and